I promised that there was two different ways of solving this problem, and the layout grid is the first one, and it's useful. If I disable showing the layout grid now, and we come over to this Divine Proportion palette, and if you're not seeing this, come up to Window, go to Composition Panels, and make sure that you're seeing the Divine Proportion. The idea here with the Divine Proportion is, first of all, that this does not work with every aspect ratio document like the rule of thirds does. And the reason why is because it's got a very specific mathematical formula that defines the bounding edges of this document. Now you can see that, and I'll just grab the crop tool here and make a selection so that you can see this very clearly. You can see that very clearly here, that these blue lines that I'm cropping down to, these blue lines are going to represent the bounding edges of the Divine Proportion tool. And if you're going to work with the Divine Proportion tool, you want to use a document that is either cropped to or made to work at the Divine Proportion bounding box, because otherwise the mathematical formulas just aren't going to make any kind of sense. Now, that said, if we just go ahead and crop this, and you'll notice here that the second I crop that, it changes. Right now it's set to 109. We want to set that back to 100%. And this will bring us back. And you can see here that I didn't quite crop it at a really good spot there. So I'm just going to crop it a little bit more precisely like so. Make sure that my size didn't change. We're all good. All right, so this is now in a proportion that makes sense for using our Divine Proportion tool. Now, this is working for our landscape orientation, and you can see in our landscape orientation that we have many different ways that we can arrange this Divine Proportion tool. Now, what is the Divine Proportion tool, and what is the underlying philosophy that makes this work? Well, basically, if we come and we turn these spirals and these axis lines off, and then we're just looking at our grid here, and we reduce the levels to 1. Effectively, this is the heart of the Divine Proportion, or what is known as the golden mean or the golden rectangle. The idea is basically that we're using a rectangle that has an aspect ratio of 1 to 1.618 approximately. And the final outcome of that is that when we divide this by creating a square, what we're left over with is a rectangle that has the exact same aspect ratio of the larger rectangle. And if we keep dividing by removing squares, you'll see that each time that we remove a square, we end up with, again, another rectangle that has the same aspect ratio. We can keep doing this down and down and down and down. And each time we divide by removing a square, we end up with a smaller and smaller rectangle that, again, we can remove the square from. So the idea here is that by following this division, we effectively arrive at a focal point. And if we follow the edges of this with a logarithmic spiral, we end up with what's known as the golden spiral. And then we can also use these axis points that will allow us to figure out where our primary and secondary focal points should be. So if I'm coming over here with my pencil tool, this would be my primary focal point right here. This would be my secondary focal point. The interesting thing here is that if we change our orientation in our landscape, you'll see that this becomes our primary focal point and this becomes our secondary. Now, if I flip over to here and I put a primary here like so and a secondary here, and then I go like this, you can see that this now becomes my primary, this becomes my secondary. If you pay attention to what's going on here, effectively what we've ended up with is a very specific form of the rule of thirds. Remember, we have 4 focal points in the rule of thirds. This is just a more mathematically precise way at arriving at those focal points. Now, the idea is that all of these lines can help you to define interesting areas in your document for compositional purposes. The green curve, the red lines, the blue lines, all these can be things that you can line up within your composition to create interesting placement of elements. And like I said, this can be a really interesting tool for solving problems. However, I don't think it's always necessarily the best tool for creating a document from scratch. And the reason why is because I find that it causes people to get into a really predictable rut that they can't really get out of if they depend upon this tool too much. Now, another thing that's worth pointing out again is that if we switch from landscape orientation to portrait, this no longer works. And if I hit Control A and backspace to clear out those pencil lines, you'll see that again, our aspect ratio is not correct. So we would need to use something like the crop tool, come over here and crop this down like so, in order to get to a place where this tool is actually going to be meaningful for the document. Now, we can change the size, we can rotate this tool if we need to, we can change the color of the grid, the spiral, or the axis lines. We can also enable or disable the visibility of those. We can change the overall opacity. And of course, you've already seen me change the levels of the rectangles. So once we're done with setting this the way we like it, we can come over here and we can click the add button to add a preset if we want to. Now, that said, probably the place where you're going to find this to be the most useful is if we're creating a template that fits the aspect ratio of this document that we're always going to use to start something, so that we can sketch freely and then we can overlay the divine proportion tool and be able to find places where we can move things so that our composition will be better. Now, we'll come back to that when we're looking at the section on templates. But for right now, like I say, you just want to be careful with this tool because you can't just use it on any document. It has to have the proper aspect ratio in order for it to have the relationships that make any kind of sense for your document.